Alrighty guys, we are here with a new A7II video. In this one, we're actually going to be comparing the A7II against the A7 III. Now, a lot of people have been asking me in the comments and everything about the A7II. Is it good? Should we get it in 2023? What would be a good alternate for the A7II? So in this video, not necessarily going to be explaining what's going to be an alternate, but I will be going over some of the difference in getting the newest A7 camera, stepping up from the A7II into the A7 III, and then we might do an A7 III versus A7 IV comparison. But in this video, we're going to be doing A7 II. I do have the A7 IV on my overhead rig, but we will be doing the A7 II versus the A7 III. Now, I don't have the A7 III in hand. I do have a friend I can borrow it from, but a lot of the things that I'm going to be going over in this video with you guys today is going to be something that I don't necessarily need the camera here to actually tell you guys and give you the comparisons of both cameras. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the Sony A7II versus the Sony A7 III. So firstly, we're going to be talking about the sensor. Now, both of these cameras do have a 24 megapixel sensor, so you're not going to be getting too much of a difference in those categories when actually looking for a megapixel count. Now, the thing that you're going to be getting a difference from or in this category is going to be the dynamic range. Now, in the Sony A7 III, which is of course the newest update from the Sony A7II, you're gonna have a little bit more dynamic range, and that's gonna be because of the sensor. The sensor is actually the same megapixel count, but the sensor is actually produced and it gives a little bit more production as far as, you know, low light capabilities and stuff like that in the newest A7 III. So if you were looking for, you know, which one has the best sensor, if you wanted to go the best bang for your buck, I would definitely go with the A7 III. But if you're, you know, if those don't necessarily make too much of a difference to you, then of course I would go with the cheaper, and that's gonna be the Sony A7 II. And with all that being said, these both shoot 14-bit uncompressed and compressed raw images from the sensor on both of these cameras. So as far as photo capabilities, you won't necessarily see too much of a difference. Now, that dynamic range being one stop more in the A7 III, it's basically going to allow you to shoot outside and still, you know, the camera will still be able to reproduce the images and the colors that it's going to see outside without blowing off the highlights and the darks being so muddy that it's literally no information in the darks. Now up next, we're gonna be talking about the ISO range. Now in the Sony A7 II, it goes up to 25,000 ISO, but you won't really wanna use this camera at that 25,000 ISO limit. And then in the Sony A7 III, you have 51,000 ISO limit. But in the A7 III, with that newly kind of updated and backside illuminated sensor, it kind of gives you a little bit more of an ISO reproduction when it gets higher in the ISO range. So the ISO range for the Sony A7 III is going to be a lot better, a lot more advanced than the Sony A7 II. Now, if you're thinking, you know, you won't be doing too much low light shooting, you won't be in too much low light scenarios, then I would say go with the Sony A7 II, save you a couple bucks there. And of course, I wouldn't use this bad baby over like 6400. It gets a little muddy after that. But if you were looking to have the most ISO, go A7 III. If you were looking to have good ISO reproduction, but not have the maximum ISO being used all the time, I would of course go with the Sony A7 II. It's gonna be your better bang for your buck. And across the board, you're probably gonna have both of these cameras, depending on your shooting scenario and where you are shooting at. They're gonna kind of be close to each other until you get into those extreme low light situations. And then in that case, the Sony A7 III will take the cake in this category. Now up next, this is gonna be a big one, and a lot of people are probably gonna be listening to this part of the video, and that's gonna be the autofocus here in the cameras. Now we did just do the beginner's guide episode 3, and we did talk about how the Sony A7 II only have 117 autofocus points. That's across the whole 24 megapixel full frame sensor. Now, if we look at the Sony A7 III, you guys are gonna be shocked depending, to see that the A7 III, its, flagship, newest camera coming out right after the Sony A7 II in line, it's gonna have like 5 times more autofocus points. The Sony A7 III comes in at 693 autofocus points. So that is literally 5 times more than the Sony A7 II. So of course, everybody asks me, will this camera be good in 2023? If you were looking to do any video, of course, it will still hold up as far as the video. But if you were looking for that autofocus, a lot of people saying that the autofocus on this camera doesn't necessarily hold up. And if you are looking for something like sports, anything where you're gonna need that autofocus to really be on point, the Sony A7 II is not gonna be for you. The autofocus points and the autofocus on this camera are not good. I mean, I've had this camera for a long time, and I can say I've tried everything to try to make it better. I've made it a little bit better, marginally better here and there, but as far as like comparing it up to the A7 III and or the A7 IV, which is 2 years ahead of this camera, but the A7 III being a year ahead of it with 5 times the autofocus points, literally just walks around this camera. So if you were looking for the best autofocus performance out of the either A7 II or A7 III, you didn't know which one to buy, of course, go with the A7 III. You're gonna get 5 times the autofocus points, and you will definitely not be upset with the autofocus performance on the Sony A7 III. Now up next, we're gonna be talking about the image stabilization. Now, when the Sony A7 II came out, it was one of the first full frame cameras that had 5-axis stabilization, and that was one of the biggest selling points to the Sony A7 II. And I would say, and I mean not would say, I'm gonna say, this was one of the reasons why I wanted to grab this camera when it first came out, was because of the IBIS. Now, I wanted to run a lot of unstabilized lenses. At that time, I didn't have the money to buy stabilized lenses, Sony E-mount, full frame. They was gonna be $2,000, $3,000 for a lens. So one of the biggest reasons, like what I have on here right now, is an unstabilized lens. This is a 45mm Sigma. The image stabilization on this camera is great. And if you're looking for that same image stabilization in the Sony A7 III, it actually shares the same amount of stabilization in that camera as well. So you're gonna get that updated ISO performance, updated autofocus performance with the same 5-axis stabilization built into the body of the camera. So you can use and run unstabilized lenses like it's nothing. So as far as the image stabilization, they both have the same, but of course that A7 III being the better spec-wise is going to be the winner in this case scenario. Of course, the Sony A7 III having those updated specs is going to be the best in this category. So let's go ahead and continue to talk about the difference between the Sony A7 II and the A7 III. All right, guys, so we're gonna be talking about video. Video here in the Sony A7 II is least to be desired, you know what I'm trying to say, least to be desired or desired, however you say that saying. But the video here for the Sony A7 II is, it's nothing. You know, you got your 1080p, you know, you have your 50p, you have your 60p if you want to shoot some slow motion, but it's only at 50 megabytes per second. The sensor in the Sony A7 II is actually 6K. You're getting a 6K downsampled to 10K, well, not 10K, to 1080p. You would think it would be good, but the way that they actually did this was it was pixel bin. So the video out of the Sony A7 II was not good, like really not good. And then coupled with the, you know, not so good low light performance, and then the bad autofocus basically just makes the video capabilities of the Sony A7 II, you know, you can find something way better nowadays for the same price tag. But let's go ahead, like we're doing, and compare it to the Sony A7 III. Now, when the Sony A7 III came out, they introduced 4K. You had 4K up to, I believe, 30 frames per second, and then you still had that 6K being downsampled to 4K, but it was not being pixel binned, so it was a little bit more quality. You know, you had a little bit more detail. Everything was way better when stepping up as far as video on the Sony A7 III. You, of course, you had S-Log and HLG. You had that on the Sony A7 II, but both of these cameras shoot 8-bit, so it's kind of not something that you want to shoot in. You don't want to shoot in a flat profile if your camera doesn't have the amount of colors to be able to bring that flat profile back to a colorful image. So kind of sucks across the board with both of these cameras because they both shoot 8-bit video. That's going to be internally and externally on the Sony A7 II and A7 III. So if you were looking to get the camera with the best video specs right now in, you know, comparing these two, you'll be looking at the Sony A7 III just because of the best autofocus performance out of these two. It has a little bit more low light performance, and of course we still got that 5-axis stabilization across the board. So for video, of course, go with the A7 III. Do not pick up the A7 II because you will be disappointed. All right, guys, so the elephant in the room here is going to have to be battery life. Now, the little small baby batteries that the NPFW50, these small baby batteries that, you know, Sony was putting in this capable camera at the time was not enough. I mean, I probably end up getting maybe 20-30 minutes worth of record time off of one of these A7 II batteries. And with the A7 III, it did bring the NP we're just gonna call it the Z100 type battery. I don't know all the other numbers are headed there, but the Z100 type battery, which is the same thing I have in my Sony A7 IV, is literally probably the best battery they could have put in their cameras. Now, it was definitely a step up from this one. I do suggest if you're looking to buy the A7 II still, get you a battery grip, run 2 batteries, and you'll be good to go. Now, on the Sony A7 III, you just grab one of those NPF or Z100 type batteries, and you throw one of those in there and you're good to go. Like, I have 3 of them for my Sony A7 IV. Usually when I go out, I only use around 1, maybe 2 if I'm shooting a lot of video. But the battery life on the Sony A7 II, if I had to put a number on it, with the camera being on and not turning it off, so if I'm just walking around the city doing some, you know, portrait photography or some street photography or something, how long would I be able to walk around with this camera? And I believe with it on idle, going into standby, you might get probably a good 2 hours out of this battery. And that's in standby and idle. It still chews throughout the battery while it's in those modes. Now, if you were looking to get the best battery life, of course, go with the Sony A7 III. Same thing I have here in the Sony A7 IV, and I've had no issues with it. I mean, literally, probably can go all day. I mean, maybe 5 hours with the camera on, not necessarily doing something the whole time with that idle and standby. So it's gonna be way better than the, what is this, the NPW50. I just looked at it, but it's gonna be way better than this smaller battery that they had in the Sony A7 II. So if you're looking for battery life and the longest battery life, of course, go the Sony A7 III. Now up next, we're gonna be talking about the touchscreen. Now the touchscreen on the Sony A7 II, it touches in certain areas, but it's not fully functional like it is on the newer cameras. So it's kind of only able to be used in certain settings. So we're not gonna get too far into that, but we're just gonna say the touchscreen here on the Sony A7 II is least to be desired just because you can't really do much on it. Of course, you still got your, you got your flippy, and then nowadays, of course, you got your flip out. So not really much you can say about the touchscreen here on the Sony A7 II. I believe they kept the same touchscreen resolution on the A7 III, but they did add some, more touch capabilities. You can touch the focus, you can touch some of the menus in there, but it isn't fully fledged touchscreen like here on the Sony A7 IV. And of course, we already know these are older cameras, so they're not gonna have the newest updates in them. But Sony A7 II, as far as the touchscreen, you're not really gonna use it. I find myself not even touching the back on the screen on the Sony A7 II. Now, on an A7 III, when I had a chance to use it and use it a little bit, I didn't really use it much touching it on the back, so I can't say that that is something that I, would tell you buy this because it got the best touchscreen. Even on the Sony A7 IV that I'm using right now, I barely ever use touch operation, and I believe I have it turned off in the camera because it actually is a little bit, it gets in the way more so than anything. But if you're looking for touchscreen capabilities, of course the A7 III is going to be better than the Sony A7 II. All right, so this is going to be the last thing, and this is going to be basically summing up everything. So the Sony A7 II, when we talk about the card slot and all of the body ergonomics compared to the A7 III, then I'm going to give my synopsis on which one I think you should buy and the reasons why. So the Sony A7 II, you only have one card slot on this camera. So if you're looking for redundant recording, you're not going to be able to get it. You only have one card slot, so if anything happens to that, you're basically, it's done for. You're not gonna be able to get that footage back. It's basically done. Now, the only differences you're gonna find on the body, aside from, of course, the thicker grip with the thicker battery, with the 2 card slots, you're actually gonna find that joystick on the back. Right here where the AF MF button actually sits on the Sony A7 II, on the A7 III, you're gonna have that joystick, and that's gonna be able to use your focus mode. If you haven't seen Beginner's Guide episode 3, we just talked about those, and not necessarily have to go into the settings to actually change it every time. You're actually able to move it around with that joystick. Other than that, I believe the ergonomics and the way everything is set up on the Sony A7 III is just about the same as it is on the A7 II. I believe you did get like a different, flip out screen, but I think it's kind of the same. Of course, you have the USB-C for charging on the Sony A7 III. You have that full HDMI slot on the A7 III. Of course, you still got your microphone and headphone port. And here on the Sony A7 II, you get your micro USB, and then you get your micro HDMI. So it's really, I guess you can say, if you were looking, and this is gonna be my conclusion right here, guys. This is gonna be my conclusion. If you were looking for the best camera, if you had to spend $600 or $700 more and you were looking at the Sony A7 II, I would say definitely go with the Sony A7 III. You're gonna get that better dynamic range. You're gonna get the better autofocus, the better low light reproduction. You're gonna get a little bit of touchscreen functionalities. You're of course gonna get a little bit better buttons and better setup as far as the ergonomics go. You're gonna, like I said, that bigger, better battery. You're gonna get those 2 card slots, so redundant recording is gonna be your friend looking for a camera here if you're looking for the Sony A7 II, or if you buy the Sony A7 II. Well, A7 III, not the A7 II, what am I talking about? So, all in all, the A7 III, I feel, is gonna be the best bang for your buck. It's gonna be doing pretty good with video, a little bit higher megabits as far as the readout and the recording read speeds for the Sony A7 III. It's gonna be a little bit quicker because the video sizes are a little bit bigger. Now, if you were looking just photos, you're not gonna be shooting no video, the Sony A7 II is gonna be the camera for you. Now, given that Sony has released these cameras to be the best of both worlds, you got good video and good photos, I don't think they actually hit that on the head until the Sony A7 III. So if you were looking for the best of both worlds and didn't want to spend $2,400, $2,300 on a Sony A7 IV, definitely look at getting the Sony A7 III. I think I've seen it for as low as like 15 and as highest of like 17. So still pretty good price tag on the camera because it's still pretty capable till this day. If I had to choose one or the other and I didn't have the Sony A7 II right here, right now, I would definitely go and pick up the Sony A7 III. Anyways, that's gonna be it for my video here on the Sony A7 II versus the A7 III. I'm gonna continue to be putting out Sony A7 II videos for the people that still are picking up the camera, the beginners on the camera, anybody that needs some help with having, or well, needing to learn how to work this camera. We will be having a beginner's guide continuing on, and we will be doing more videos on it. So if you wanna see more videos just like this one, more A7 II videos, more A7 III, more A7 IV videos, FS5 videos, make sure you guys hit that like button and hit that subscribe button. It's been your boy Christian. Hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did, I'll see you guys on that next one. Peace.